I bring you the TEDGlobal. Now, I'm guessing that everyone in this room can find the three most populous countries in the world. That would be obviously China, India, and the United States. But how about the fourth most populous country in the world? Indonesia, home to 250 million people. Who knows where it is?
Somewhere here.
Thanks to my colleagues from TEDx Dubai for filming that. It's really hard to disagree with Indonesian businessman John Riyadi when he says Indonesia is the biggest invisible thing on the planet. And I want to turn my metaphorical lens on it and try and make it a bit more visible, which is kind of cheeky because obviously I'm not even Indonesian. But I do have a long history with the country, so I worked there as a journalist for a few years in the late 80s and early 90s. And then I went back a decade later and I worked for 4 years with the Ministry of Health trying to help them figure out, as an epidemiologist, what was going on with their HIV epidemic. And I traveled a lot and I became completely entranced with the country. So much so that a couple of years ago I packed in my job and embarked on this 22,000-kilometer journey around some of the least visited parts of Indonesia. I was on cargo boats, motorbikes, and buses. And what I found was absolutely dizzying. So up here, you have Aceh, which was described by Marco Polo in 1290 as the first Mohammedan community in Southeast Asia. And it still calls itself very proudly the veranda of Mecca, and it's populated largely by traders with very Arab features and etc. If you travel the distance from the equivalent of London to Tehran, you pass 13,400 other islands, 360 ethnic groups, 700 languages, and you end up in Indonesian Papua, which is home to black-skinned Melanesians who are agriculturists. So the Indonesian national motto is very similar to the US national motto, unity in diversity. And the diversity is pretty clear, but one of the reasons that I wanted to undertake this journey was to try and figure out where the unity came from. And I was over here in Adonara one morning, waiting for a boat to take me across to the neighboring island, and there were a bunch of market women there taking their salt fish across, and they were having an incredibly heated conversation, obviously about me. But truthfully, 6:30 a.m. is not my best time of day. And they were also speaking in Bhutanese, which is a language I don't speak, and so I was kind of zoning out until one of them actually poked me on the nose. And then I had to engage. And she said, "Oh, we're so confused because we can't tell if you're Javanese or if you're Western. And they think you're Javanese because of the way you speak and because of the way you dress, but I think you're Western because of your pointy nose." And of course, I laughed, but actually I thought, wow, that's pretty amazing that people close to the geographical center of Indonesia think that someone who's from the most populous island of Java is just as foreign as someone who's from London. And that's not actually all that surprising, because for most of human history, this whole sweep of islands has been a collection of different sultanates, kingdoms, fiefdoms. Yeah, the Dutch were there as economic colonists sailing around those waters for around 350 years. But in as much as they ruled anywhere outside of Java, they did it mostly through those local potentates. So no big surprise that people have very strong local loyalties. Now, there was really no concept of nation until the founding father, Sukarno, imposed it when he declared independence in 1945. And that Declaration of Independence reads, "In its entirety, we, the people, declare the independence of the Republic of Indonesia. Matters relating to the transfer of power, etc., will be worked out carefully and as soon as possible." That's it, barely longer than a tweet. So what Sukarno and his successor Suharto, who between them ruled for 55 years, did was they tried to impose some unity, and they did it with two uniformed armies. One was the military, which had a presence down to the village level across the archipelago, and the other was the army of bureaucrats who were very, very strongly centered in Jakarta here, and it was a very centralized structure. And that worked for a while, but of course you've got all these different ethnic groups with all these different interests. And so after a while, the pressures built up, and Suharto had to step down in 1998. And there was a period of chaos, there was a lot of conflict, some of it was, there was a lot of Islamic terrorism, and some people thought that the country might even break apart. But in fact, instead, it reinvented itself as probably the most successful democratic success story of the early 21st century. And that's particularly remarkable in some eyes because Indonesia is the largest Muslim majority nation on the planet. And obviously some people think that Islam and democracy don't mix terribly well. So how did they do that? I think it's because they entrenched democracy in a radical decentralization that actually mirrors what was the pre-colonial structure, which was of separate sultanates and kingdoms and etc. And that's allowed, I believe, Indonesia to negotiate some of its differences, its many, many differences. And I want, as an example, just to talk about two of them. So Old Indonesia versus New Indonesia, and Islam versus multi-faith Indonesia. Now, Old World versus New World, Indonesians are actually living in different centuries all at the same time. So Jakarta is hyper-modern, tweets more than any other city on the planet. There are 70 million Facebook users across the country. There are 80 million people living without electricity, and some people living in some fairly ancient traditions. So, example, I was invited to a party by a friend, and her sister-in-law was giving a party, and we got all dressed up in our best kit, and we went to the market and bought a present, and then we went down, and it was very, very busy, this party, and she threads me through and introduces me to her sister-in-law, who's sitting quietly receiving guests. Very quietly, in fact, because she's been dead for 8 days. And this is her funeral party, and many cows are going to die today. Now, when the village isn't covered with sacrificial buffalo, it looks like this. And obviously, you can't have the same building code for something like this in West Sumber as you have for something like this in Jakarta. Now, in the Suharto years, that was problematic because you used to have this one-size-fits-all approach to government. But because of these new democratic sultanates, you're able to do something that's much more nuanced and have much more locally appropriate regulations. So another example comes from whale hunting. There are 2 villages in Indonesia, to my knowledge, that hunt whales, and one of them is La Malera, which is over here. And on this beach, strewn about with whale bones, people launch their rickety wooden boats, as they have for at least 600 years, to our knowledge, and they go with bamboo harpoons and hunt for whales. And I went out with them one day, and there was a hole in the boat, and there was a hole in the bailer as well, which was inconvenient. We'd forgotten to take an anchor, and on top of that, I was the only person on the boat who was not pie-eyed drunk. So truthfully, we weren't that much of a threat to the cetacean population. But they do catch whales, on average between 8 and 12 a year, and that's enough to feed the village for a year when they dry it and cook it up in this filthy stew. And it's also enough to enrage foreign NGOs who make emotive YouTube videos about whale slaughter and call for boycotts of Indonesian tuna. Now, La Malera doesn't even fish for tuna, but other parts of Indonesia do. It's a big industry. So Jakarta feels that it has to have a regulation, so it rushes out a ban on whale hunting. And in the old days, in the Suharto days, that would have got passed down through the hierarchy to the Jakarta-appointed district head, and he would have tried to impose it. But now, of course, the district head is appointed directly by the local electorate. And what that means is that when he tries to impose a law like this, everyone goes to his office, protests, and it's quietly shelved. So Jakarta is making laws for the modern, social activist, globalized YouTube Indonesia, and local governments are managing to modify those for the life of our forefathers type Indonesia, and actually it works pretty well. Now, the Islam versus multi-faith thing is slightly more complex. Indonesia so there are 210 million of the 250 million Indonesians are Muslim, but it was never an Islamic state. That was highly contested around independence, but the constitution in the end guarantees freedom of religion. So there are many religions, including, that's the blood of the chicken in which my future in whose entrails my future was read. So there's but at times of economic meltdown, there tends to be a resurgence in Islamic extremism. And I'm sure many of you will remember the most distressing recent example, which was a bombing of a Bali nightclub in 2002, in which 200-odd people died. Now, we haven't actually seen many incidents like that since 2002, which is when the radical decentralization started to take place. And I think that that's because you now have a situation where people up in the veranda of Mecca, for example, can make Sharia laws locally without it affecting or scaring the Christians who live over here, for example, in Ambon. So it's a way of diffusing tensions. But there's something else going on as well, which is that Islamic extremism has been Indonesianized. Now, I learned this in a peculiarly seedy gay bar in North Jakarta, where I was doing some HIV research about 10 years ago, and this bunch of leather-jacketed thugs came in, and my slightly naive study team thought they were just clubbers and started waving syringes at them and trying to sign them up for HIV tests. And they turned tail and fled. And I went back to the club a couple of years later just to say hi to the manager, Eris, and we were sitting in her office, maybe 2 a.m, and this guy comes up, and he's all out of breath, and he says, they're here, the FPI are here. Now, the FPI is the Islamic Defenders Front, and they defend Islamic morality by smashing up bars and clubs. So this was actually pretty scary. But Eris, cool as a cucumber, she just reaches into her drawer, takes out this fat envelope, and the guy comes in, and he's got his skull cap and his scraggly beard and his long white robes, and there's a lot of salaam alaikuming, and then she hands over the envelope, and he leaves. And I look at her and I say, you know, those guys are just as bad as the leather-jacketed thugs ever were. And she looks at me as if I'm a bit simple and says, Elizabeth, they're not as bad as those guys. They are those guys. It's the same guys, but now by dressing up in Islamic kit, the police don't get on their case so much. So it turns out that extremism is something, like many things in Indonesia, that you can solve with a fat envelope. Now, this has actually been reflected in the political process also, where the mainstream party, there was a party formed in 2002 called the PKS, and they were modeled explicitly on Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, and like the Muslim Brotherhood, they did very good work for poor communities and became very popular very rapidly. And 2 years later, they won 7% of the national vote, and everyone was like, oh my God, Islamization through the ballot box. But in fact, it turns out that in Indonesia that can't happen. Because if you want to be part of this new democratic process in this hyper-diverse nation, you have to play ball with everyone. So the government at the time wanted the PKS in their cabinet, so they gave them some cabinet posts, including the Minister of Agriculture, and the PKS, wanting to cement their relationships with all the other parties, started generously to dole out beef import licenses, which was completely illegal. So now the head of the PKS is in jail, and no one talks anymore about Islamic extremism through the ballot box. And these sorts of hyper-democratic but very patronage-based networks are actually a very good way of diffusing potential conflict in this diverse nation. Now, Indonesia had an election just a little while ago, and it was very highly contested. The winner was someone who represents a new generation that's come up through this decentralized system, who represents meritocracy and public service. But he's ranged against a parliament which is still controlled by the old guard. And I don't have to tell any Americans who are watching this what happens when you have a popular reformist president who is beholden to a sclerotic and obstructionist legislature. So the infighting has already begun, and it's actually a little bit ugly, but the fighting has not. And in a country that is so diverse and that's only been democratic for 15 years, that's actually pretty miraculous. And so I would say, you know, I came in arrogantly saying, I want to make Indonesia more visible. But in fact, Indonesia has none of the coups of Thailand, none of the political assassinations of the Philippines, none of the monolithic parties of Singapore and arguably Malaysia, none of the suppression of public dissent of the Arab world. The reason that you don't know about it is because it's not producing any of the political chaos that keeps countries on the front page. And I would say, actually, that if invisibility is the price of democratic success, long may it remain invisible. Thank you.
Elizabeth, you mentioned at the end the election of the new president, Joko Widodo, and the fact that it's still fragile, this transition. And indeed, just 2 days ago, the outgoing president, his party actually in parliament basically stripped away some of the rights to elect local mayors and regional leaders. How's that playing out? It kind of contradicts what you just said.
It does. I'm still quite optimistic because Indonesians have a phenomenal talent for compromise and for muddling through. At the moment, this really is a reaction of the old guard against this threat that is posed by this very democratic system, because this very democratic system is actually producing politicians who answer to the electorate. And I think we've heard a lot in the last few days about how electorates actually don't feel that they are represented adequately. And this actually has provided some representation. But there's a great disconnect between the center, Jakarta, and the periphery. Yeah. And this decentralization was a way of dealing with that. I don't think they'll get away with rolling it back, because there is such a strong feeling now of this is my right. So Indonesians have developed a sense of democratic rights in a very, very short space of time. And I wouldn't be surprised if you did read more about it on your front pages in the next couple of months, because I think people will fight to defend those rights. But once they're defended, I think that democracy will be consolidated.
Just a curiosity, I read your book, Indonesia, etc., which refers to the etc. in the Declaration of Independence. And you barely make any mention of the Indonesia that Westerners know, which is Bali. Why so?
Because it's the Indonesia that Westerners already know. They don't need me to tell them about it.
Okay, Elizabeth, thank you very much.
Thank you.